We now welcome in a very special guest, Greg Madia of the Charlottesville Daily Progress and formerly of the Daily News Record in Harrisonburg. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Bennett, Jack, good to see your guys' faces. Nice to be with you guys. Haven't talked to you guys in a while. Good to see you though.
Yeah, we're amped to have you on. You obviously know JMU and UVA probably better than most reporters across the state. So you've got a ton of insights there. And I think JMU fans and maybe even Kurt Signetti with some recent comments is kind of looking past Buck now. So we're we're all kind of eyes on UVA at this point. So we're excited for your insights on the program.
Yeah, for sure. Virginia's got a big one before that though. They've got Tennessee. So I'm sure the Who's are all in on the Vols before getting to that in-state clash, which should be a great game down the road on September 9th.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of hilarious, the difference in schedules where JMU has an FCS team that was, I think, picked to finish last in the Patriot League, not even a full scholarship, and then UVA on the other side, they have a Tennessee team that is looking to have one of the best seasons in recent memory, and it's just like, oh, what a complete difference. We've already thrown out one game where UVA fans probably haven't even thought about JMU once during this offseason when there's Tennessee first.
Yeah, I will say I think the Virginia fan base knows what James Madison has built on the other side of the mountain, right? I think there's some respect there for what James Madison has done, not only in their final half decade or so at the FCS level, but also what they did last year in their debut season as an FBS member. So I don't want to say out of sight, out of mind with Virginia fans, but certainly the focus for the UVA fan base is on this first one, right? It'll be their first game post tragedy. What happened this past November on grounds, as they call it in Charlottesville, with the shooting that involved the Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis Jr. and Deshaun Perry. So sad. It'll be their first game when they play Tennessee in Nashville on September 2nd. So a lot of emotion will be going into that one for the Who's before they open up their home slate against the Dukes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was interested from your perspective how the team has sort of used that maybe as a motivating factor. Obviously, you've got returners, but then you also have some transfers who weren't with the program that have sort of, I guess, maybe assimilated since then.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and you don't have to look any further than Mike Hollins, the running back and surviving victim of that tragedy, right? Went through a ton of, stuff in the hospital where he had to get his gunshot wounds healed in his stomach and just fight to get back on a football field. Obviously, doctors had told him it might be a few months before he can put his socks on. And in a matter of months, he was back on a practice field practicing during the spring. So it's an incredible story, inspirational story. And I think the team looks at him as their inspiration in addition to the friends and teammates that they lost in Chandler, Davis, and Perry. I think Tony Elliott, the second-year coach at Virginia, former Clemson offensive coordinator, he also gained a lot of respect from within the locker room about how he handled everything in times of tragedy. Last year on the field for Virginia, was not great. 3-7, a lot of changes, offensive scheme, defensive scheme. The offense, which was exciting, and Bennett, this from covering them a little bit, was exciting with Robert and I and Brennan Armstrong and slinging the ball all over the yard there for a little bit. And frankly, last year it wasn't. So it was a tough first on the field year, but when the tragedy happened, Elliott, he did a really admirable job of leading them through, and they're still dealing with it, right? It doesn't go away just because a new season is here. He's done a really good job leading the team, and I've had a couple of players tell me that, that they're willing to play for Elliott. They're willing to run through a wall for Elliott because of the way he handled everything. And I think that's important to remember as some new faces have come into Virginia, some old faces have left, right? Armstrong's now at NC State. The Nick Jackson, the former standout linebacker, he's now at Iowa. Some older players that were on that team are gone. But the guys who stayed are really, really bought into what Elliott's vision is and want to play for him and want to get it right, not only for him, but for the teammates they lost and for Hollins, too, who fought so hard, and then for themselves who've been dealing with a lot, mentally, and then, of course, on the field, too, want to get it right.
Yeah, you mentioned a few of the guys who left. Armstrong, the biggest name of them all. They brought in Tony Muskett, kind of a lot of storylines throughout this offseason around the quarterback position with UVA. What can JMU fans expect for UVA's game against Tennessee, but then also the game against JMU when Tony Muskett takes that first snap under center.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. He as soon as he came to Virginia, arrived from Monmouth in January, he was kind of atop the depth chart there. It appeared he'd be the favorite to win the job, but would have to battle for it to get it. In the spring, there was, I don't even know if you can call it a battle. There was a little bit of a competition when Jay Woolfolk was able to participate in football. At the time, Jay Woolfolk was still trying to do both the football and the baseball. He's a star reliever for the baseball team. And he pitched really, really well. He's awesome. I cover baseball too. And it's like, you see 97 on the gun with the fastball and then a wipeout slider. It's like, that he's got a pretty good shot in baseball. So he actually made the decision over the summer to just focus on baseball, which took himself out of the quarterback competition, obviously. So Muskett, clear-cut starter at that point in the summer. Though Elliott, didn't announce anything until earlier this week when he named Muskett the starter. He had to battle a little bit with Anthony Calandria, a freshman. But Muskett, I think what you're getting is somebody with experience, albeit at the FCS level at Monmouth. Played really, really well there for 3 seasons, which included a shortened COVID season. That spring year that James Madison played in too. He had played that spring for Monmouth. 51 touchdowns compared to 16 interceptions in his 3 seasons there. 2-time, all Big South player. Last year in the CAA, right? Monmouth moved up to the CAA a year ago, and he said that was he had told me he thought that was good for his development. A little bit tougher competition in the CAA than the Big South. Now he's making another jump from the CAA to the Power 5 and the ACC. So I think he realizes he's probably got to get rid of the ball quicker. He said just in practice, he can tell from playing against Virginia's defensive line how quick the defensive line gets back there compared to what it is at the FCS level. So that's something to watch. And as far as how he'll perform, right, it's as good a question as there is. When he takes the field in Nashville, he'll be playing against a crowd that I think I added it up. It's like 3.5 times larger than the biggest crowd he's ever played in front of.
Nice.
So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But he's mature. He understands the opportunity he has, and it's not like Virginia was his only offer out of the portal. He had some Group of 5 offers. Missouri was involved as well and offered. So he wasn't just a guy looking for a place to play and hoping that he could get an FBS offer. He had other opportunities and chose Virginia, chose to play in his home state.
Nice to have a coach who names a starting quarterback before September. That's cool.
From covering James Madison and Kurt Signetti, he'll hint at it though. He'll hint at it and tell you how it'll feel. I covering the Ben DiNucci, Cole Johnson battle, and then what was it, Cole Johnson, and I can't even remember who it was. A couple of years after that,
who was it that next time?
It was kind of Cole's job to lose.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think
the spring season. And
Gage.
Oh yeah,
Malone,
Gage
that's
Malone.
right. So there you go. He'll hint at it. So I guess whoever's playing better between Alonzo Barnett and the Arizona transfer McLeod will be who gets that job.
Starting to do some Barnett hits, so we'll see if that comes to fruition. I think that was unexpected, but interesting for sure. I know when JMU fans look at UVA, there's obviously excitement about possibly winning the game, but maybe not a lot of knowledge of like where Virginia is strong, where Virginia has some questions. Can you take us through some of those overarching position groups and sort of where you see strengths and where you might see some question marks?
Yeah, and I think for the Virginia fan base too, it's like, if this team's going to improve upon the 3-7 mark that it registered last year, you got to look at that defense and particularly the defensive line. The defense was much improved under John Rudzinski, the coordinator who joined Tony Elliott's staff after being at Air Force and being the defensive coordinator for the Falcons there. They did a really good job, lowered the points per game by like 7.5 points. They only gave up about 24 points per game last year, and that defense kept them in games they probably shouldn't have been in if you watch their offense. So that'll tell you something. That defensive line is really good. I've covered some really good defensive lines in the past, and this one is really good too. I think, you look at the Senior Bowl watch list came out earlier today. Three of their 4 starters are on that watch list. So NFL people are paying attention. Chico Bennett Jr. Is a standout defensive end. He's been a little banged up in training camp, but he's a player that can absolutely get to the quarterback. 7 sacks in 10 games last year. Cam Butler transferred to Virginia ahead of last season from Miami of Ohio. Really good player, veteran player, 6th-year guy. Has played in, I think, 50 career games and started 40 something of them, maybe 40. I'd have to look back at that. But he's got 35.5 tackles for loss in his career and can really do a number of different things. On the interior, Aaron Famui, Bennett, I know you're familiar with him. He's been around a long time. Jameer Carter, too, who's probably an NFL guy this time next year. Could be a factor as well. And then they're deep there also. They'll probably play 3 or 4 guys off the bench on the D line with Ben Smiley, Paul Akiri, and Michael Diata. So that D line is very, very good. And it's a D line. I've talked to some ACC coaches that, is not only good for being the strength of Virginia's team, but is one of the better D lines in the ACC and maybe even the country if they get the production that they think they can get this fall. So that's probably where they're strongest. Where they're weakest, it's the offensive line. It remains the biggest question. They couldn't protect Brennan Armstrong. Part of the reason why that quarterback spot was such an albatross for Virginia last year is because Brennan Armstrong was trying to get rid of the football and couldn't because they had defensive linemen and linebackers running and blitzers coming free and taking down the quarterback. His interception ratio was 7 touchdowns to 12 interceptions last year, and you can't have that and expect to be a good football team. So that's got to improve the O-line. They've brought in new faces there up front. Ugonna transfer from Houston. He'll probably be a starter. Brian Stevens, a transfer from Dayton of the non-scholarship Pioneer Football League. He's in the mix and probably will be a player for them. Jimmy Chris from Penn State is in too, but he's been banged up in training camp. So I don't know if he'll be a starter for them, but somebody that should help them at some point this year. Up front. And the new O-line coach is Terry Heffernan, who came to Virginia from Stanford, was part of David Shaw's staff at Stanford. And I think what he does, I think the biggest difference in Terry Heffernan and the previous O-line coach, Garrett Touge, is Heffernan's background kind of fits what Tony Elliott and the offensive coordinator Des Kitchings want to do. And that's be balanced, run that pro-style attack. Touge was a holdover from Bronco Mendenhall era and the Robert and I regime on offense. And that's a different style of offensive line play than what Virginia wants to do. So I'm curious to see if Heffernan's background maybe lends itself to some more offensive line success for UVA.
I loved watching Bennett's reactions to some of those names you were mentioning where you could see he remembered them. And then he just kind of was like, oh yeah, that's going to be that might be an issue come game time.
The Aaron Famui, I always forget, still has eligibility. It feels like he's been there for a decade.
Well, he and Butler were the 2 players who decided to take advantage. The NCAA, after the tragedy last year, ruled that players who had expired eligibility last season, seniors who had expired eligibility last season could return for this year. There were only 2 Virginia players to take the NCAA up on that offer, and one was Famui, the other was Cam Butler. They're 2 of their better defensive limenmen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They're like old up front, right? There's difference between like juniors and seniors up on that D line. They're like, 23, 24-year-old guys on that D line. That's a grown men defensive line.
Yeah. That'll prove to be a little bit of an issue for JMU because Kurt Cignetti at the end of fall camp yesterday said that pass protection has been one of the things that has been I guess one of his biggest issues with the team. So if JMU is unable to have good protection for whether it's Barnett or McLeod, how will this UVA defense attack JMU?
They got after quarterbacks and offensive linemen that couldn't block them last year. I mean, even up at Syracuse, Bennett had a multi-sack game. Down at Georgia Tech, I can't remember how many sacks there were, but there were like a couple of players with at least 1 sack at Virginia. So I think, that's part of their defensive style, though. Then their defensive coordinator, John Rudzinski, he's going to find the weaknesses. He's a smart guy. He'll find the weaknesses and exploit. And if Virginia senses that's a weakness, then that's what they'll do. But that JMU whole line, man, they got guys that are still there when I was covering them.
Yeah,
I mean, Nick Kidwell and Cole Potts and Tyler Stevens, they were all guys who were playing on that during that spring season and really starting to first contribute then, and then they blossomed into excellent offensive linemen and good players for JMU.
Yeah, you mentioned the defensive line being old for UVA. I think the offensive line for JMU is also very old. Somehow, some way, they still have eligibility. COVID has made that quite an interesting thing.
I will say it's pretty significant that Kurt Signetti and the O-line coach there, Damian Roblewski, have got those guys to stay, right? Yeah. I mean, if those guys hit the portal, man, they'd be sought after, right? I mean, it's so hard to find good offensive linemen and to keep them at JMU for this long, and that's a credit to those coaches.
Yeah, for sure. And the last question I had that I think is always interesting for me is I hear like Musket looks pretty good, running back room is deep, defensive line is really old, and then their win total is at 3.5. So it's hard for me to kind of square, I guess, what's a successful season for UVA, given they do have some talent, they do have some question marks. You mentioned the offensive line. Are they thinking it's kind of a bowl season for them, or is the goal just to make some steady progress in year 2 with Tony Elliott?
I think they'll take progress. The players would love to make a bowl game, though. I mean, that's the goal for any college football program, right? When you're outside of Alabama and Georgia, which has sights set on national championships, and it's realistic for those programs to have the sights set on national championships. For most college football programs, it's competing for a conference title and getting to a bowl game. And I've talked to some Virginia players about it, and they say, of course, that's the you can't listen to the external expectations. They were picked to finish last in the ACC. But I think they also believe they have a little more than what people think. Some of it with all the new faces, sometimes that gets lost in preseason rankings and win totals, and But I think a lot of it will come down to how well they can fix that offensive line, and if Tony Musket can protect the football, right? I'd mentioned Brennan Armstrong, 12 interceptions last year. I think about the Pitt game, he threw interceptions for touchdowns on the first 2 throws he had that Saturday. I mean, you can't win games when you're down 14-0 before it even really gets going. They played closer games last year that people forget about. Miami was a 4 overtime game, 14-12, just defensive slugfest, offensive disaster type of ball game for both sides, but 4 overtimes. They played Carolina to 3 points. Carolina and Drake May, and actually did a pretty good job against May. I think up until then, he was just carving people up, and Virginia's defense did a decent job against him. Josh Downs, not so much, but you take some and you lose some. For me, I think with their schedule, it's probably going to be tough to get to 6 wins, but I do think their defense will keep them in more games than people think. Their non-conference schedule is very tough with Tennessee, JMU, and Maryland out of the gate. What helps them, though, is in the ACC, they missed both Florida State and Clemson this year. So I think that's something that if you're looking at Virginia's schedule and you think, it's tough, well, you do miss the 2 big boys in the conference.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly helpful. The 14-12 4 overtime sounds like a grind to cover. So good on you for sitting through the whole thing.
You got to make it interesting in the story, though. It does make for some interesting quotes afterward.
I can only imagine.
Sit through a game like that.
Some interesting questions too, probably from the media.
Yeah, of course.
Quite the turn of events. They're a fascinating program because they were all offense, no defense in Bronco Mendenhall's final year. To go from that to defense keeping them in games, offense not being able to move the ball it's a wild twist.
Yeah, it was quite the change, and that was part of the issue last year a little bit for Virginia. Is they had players that had a lot of success on offense under Mendenhall and Anai. Particularly Brennan Armstrong and his receivers, Dontavian Wicks and Keaton Thompson and guys like that, the late Lavelle Davis, Billy Kemp. But it was a drastic change, right? Going from air raid, a little bit of backyard football with the quarterback to pro style, regimented timing, precision. And then you throw in the fact that they didn't have the offensive line, right? They lost some really good players in the transfer portal ahead of last season, mainly the center, Olu Oluwatimi, who won the Ringington Award at Michigan. It was a tough change when you factor in that for the offense, between all the losses and the attrition on the offensive line and the drastic change in system and principles.
Yeah. Quite the shift. Jack, you got anything else?
No, that's it. Just want to say thank you, Greg, for joining us. Before you get up on out of here, can you let fans know where they can follow your work if they're not already? I imagine a vast majority of people listening to this podcast already follow you on Twitter, but for the few that don't, how can they follow along with your work as they get ready for that JMU UVA game?
Yeah, at Greg Madia on Twitter and dailyprogress.com for the stories. The stories are, Charlottesville paper, Richmond paper, Roanoke paper. So if you find them, you could read them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Greg.
Yeah, guys, happy to do it. Take care.